So firstly, I will briefly introduce our network, the Chinese Open Science Network, before you get started. Then I will like the screen is yours, so you can start share screen.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, I think people are so many audience already know that I will have introduction about our network, so they may choose come later. Just skip this part. Uh, right. So just as a reminder, most audience here they don't turn on their camera, so maybe, but I will keep my camera on during the whole talk. And also, if you can like talk a bit slowly to suit our audience, that'd be great.
Yes, and feel free to interrupt me to slow down or explain something again or anything else as needed. I don't mind.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so I will start my very brief introduction about Chinese Open Science Network. So here is the guideline for our for joining the event. So usually we ask our audience to mute themselves after entering the Zoom room, just avoid like instant noise. So before I get started, we have a very brief introduction. Of course. So firstly, good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending on where you are. Welcome to our 100th Open Talks. Uh, so today we wanted to have Brian Nosek from Center for Open Science. But before I gave him a formal introduction, I will briefly introduce the grassroots work behind the saying. So the grassroots network that organizing the Open Talk series. So we are grassroots network that promoting open science and using Chinese. But of course, we also use English. Sometimes we will introduce inviting speakers from international community, and we are trying to build an online community to for open science, transparent and reproducible research. So this grassroots network was started about 10 years ago. So here, that's our first Chinese open science workshop. And that was after I have a half year visit to Oxford. At that time, I was fortunate enough to attend a conference organized by the British Psychology Society. I think they invited Brian and Chris Chambers to give a talk. So I was persuaded at that event that open science is great and we should all do adapt the open science practices. So after I came back, I initiated the first workshop, and then we have our uh, WeChat channel because most Chinese people using WeChat, so we use this as our main media channel. And then about 6 years ago, we started our first open talk, and then goes on. We inviting people to give talk, and now comes to the 100th open talks. So we organize a series of online events. Open Talks is one of our most well maintained. And what talks are either related to open science reproducibility or is related to career development for early career researchers. We also invite early career researchers to share their work to increase their visibility to the community. We also organize other online events, open tutorials. So we invite senior PhD or doc or postdoc or even a young junior PI to share their tutorial, their skills in a hands-on manner. And we also have Open Minds. So it's an online journal club. We emphasize open science and reproducibility and methods. So just it's like a bunch of people reading papers, classicals or recent ones that related to open science together. And we also translate many valuable articles or blog posts into Chinese to help early career researchers to overcome the language barriers. Each year, we also organize a hackathon, which is a new format widely adopted by like in computational science, but also in society for the improvement of psychological science. We think it's a great way for learn new methods and also to create opportunity for connection and collaboration. And we hope that our WeChat channel, as well as the whole network, serve as the platform for researchers, like all researchers, especially for early career researchers, so that we can have a community without boundary. So everyone are welcome to join us, especially join our steering committee to initiate, to invite new talks or coordinate talks like this. So here is the Chinese version. And so in the past almost 10 years, we published two papers. One is a position paper in AMPPS, like 3 years ago, also a book chapter. And we translated Chris Chambers' the Seven Deadly Sins of Psychology into Chinese, which was published 2 years ago. And last year, we also published Open Science Guideline for researchers under resource limited circumstances, like many of us. So that's us, the Chinese Open Science Network behind the Open Talks today. Today we comes to the 100th Open Talks, so it's a huge milestone for us. And we are honored to have Brian Nosek, the founder of Center for Open Science, professor at University of Virginia, and he is pioneering in open science in psychology and have done so many work. And of course, the famous one, the classical one, was the 2015 Open Science Collaboration, which replicated 100 studies. And then comes to recent one, the SCORE project. So I think then SCORE, Brian, the time is yours. You will introduce us more about Center for Open Science and the SCORE project. Yeah.
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
inviting me to present, and thank you for all the work that the Open Science Network is doing. It's amazing to see the summary, and it's so much of this movement to reform and be more transparent and reproducible with our research is a grassroots effort. So thank you all for your participation, enthusiasm, advancement, and leadership in this. I would like to just give an introduction to how it is that the Center for Open Science is trying to increase openness, integrity, and trustworthiness of research. And I thought I would do that by describing some of the work that we just published last week that is the culmination of a 7-year project that's called the SCORE Initiative. And this is a project that was funded by DARPA in the United States and involved a large investigation that I will sort of unpack as we get into it. But it is part of the center's broader mission to try to support reforms that could improve the integrity and trustworthiness of research, and is really just an exciting area of work these days in science, because there's so many opportunities to improve how it is we go about the process of doing the work and rewarding researchers for doing good research. And so I'm pleased to have a chance to chat with you today. Let me start with something that's really part of the fundamentals of just some terms that are used and used in various ways for understanding the reliability of research evidence. And there's three that are the core of central interest to the SCORE project. When we conduct the same analysis on the same data, we should observe the same result that was reported in the original paper. We refer to this as being reproducible. This is distinct from when you take the same data and you apply alternative analysis strategies to that to test the same question. We consider that evaluating whether the finding is robust. When you make different decisions about what data to include or exclude, what model to use, what way you are combining the measures, those decisions may have consequences for the results, and knowing how much variation there is a question of robustness. And then the third topic of repeatability that is of core interest is when we ask the same question, but in different data, do we observe similar evidence as the original research? And this is a question of, is the finding replicable or not? Now, these terms are important to spell out at the outset because they've been used in very different ways. And what you will observe in our evidence that we review for SCORE is that they do not necessarily show the same type of evidence on any given research claim. But we care about each of these things in terms of how much they show repeatability because they provide us some evidence about how reliable is the research findings that we are producing. Replicability is often seen as the ultimate one because it identifies something about a regularity in nature. It isn't just something that occurred in this particular data set at this particular time, but rather it is something that we can show in different contexts, depending on what the research question is and when we think we can observe it. And we wrote a paper, Tim Arrington and I, in 2020 in PLOS Biology talking about the advancement of replicability. And we sort of explain it in this way. On the left side is an initial discovery. We're doing research in my lab and we think we found something. That what we found is that blue dot. And what we think it means is something more general than the particular context in which we observed it. We observed it with a specific sample, the units of study. We might have used specific treatments, the interventions that we applied in that context. We might have used specific outcome measures, the O, and the setting was a particular context in the way in which that experiment was done. So in that specific case, we think we've observed that finding in dark blue, but we think we've discovered something more general that doesn't just apply in my lab for that sample with those treatments, with those outcomes. We think we've established something that's a more interesting phenomenon about the world. And so we believe that it may apply more broadly in the universe of places that it could be observed. In light blue is where it might generalize, where we might see that finding again. And so as research continues and we're investigating that phenomenon and we're looking for different occasions where we observe it, we're trying to validate the measures that we use or the interventions that we use, we accumulate a body of evidence. And sometimes in the color versions, we observe, we found it here, and we also observe it here, and we also observe it here. And as we observe that phenomenon on multiple different occasions, in multiple different samples, in different settings, our blue area expands. We think we've established something that is a regularity, and it's not just dependent on a particular sample or a particular treatment or a particular outcome, but it is a more general phenomenon. And that dark blue starts to fill out the light blue area in showing that where we thought it might apply are places where this is applying. But also we observe failures to replicate. We do a study where we think, oh, it might happen here in this, with this sample, with this type of treatment, with these types of outcomes, but we don't observe it. And so in those cases, it shrinks our assumed generalizability, where we think it will apply, and the light blue area gets smaller, which are those areas where we think it might apply, but we haven't investigated those areas yet. And there's more gray area where we think it will not apply. In fact, now we have evidence that it does not apply. And so the mature understanding, the way that replication contributes to understanding of phenomena, is that we fill out more and more dark blue of being able to clarify and specify when is it that we will observe evidence for this finding and when will we not? And ideally, that now has an explanation, a theory that helps to account for how it is we can observe evidence for these phenomena. So that's part of the context of the SCORE project, where these ideas of repeatability, reproducibility, robustness, replicability are important for establishing regularities, understandings in nature that help to inform our theories, our understanding, our ability to predict the future. So SCORE asked a fundamental question, which is how repeatable are the social and behavioral sciences? And the approach was to ask a big question, which was, can we have machines, artificial intelligence, predict for us which findings are replicable and not replicable? And DARPA's interest in that was saying that it would be nice if we had indicators that were rapidly deployable, that could be used in a variety of contexts, that didn't require the same amount of resources as running an entire replication study, that could give us some early indication of this finding might be highly reliable or this finding is doubtful for whatever reasons that the AI systems identified. This project started in 2019, so it was before the large language model revolution that we are currently witnessing. And so the teams that got involved in this were using some very innovative AI systems that were right at around 2019, 2020. So that was the goal, was to see if the machines could predict replicability. But in order to see if the machines could do that, we had to collect a lot of evidence from the literature to see if we could find a case to collect evidence of replicability for the machines to try to predict. And so that's the evidence that I will summarize today, is what is it that we gathered from the literature to try to feed the machines to see if they could predict the outcomes. So our sample for SCORE was to take 62 journals from across a variety of different fields in the social and behavioral sciences. So you can see here we looked at criminology journals, economics, education, finance, health research, marketing, management, organizational behavior, political science, psychology, public administration, sociology. So a wide range of quantitative social and behavioral research. And from those 62 journals, we sampled about 50 papers per year from 2000, the issues published from 2009 through 2018. The project started in 2019, so this is the 10 years prior to when the project started, created our sample of papers, where in each of these papers, we extracted a primary claim. So we went to the abstract, found a claim in the abstract, and then traced to the paper to a piece of quantitative evidence in the paper that is the author said supported that claim in the abstract. And so for this about 4,000 papers, we had these traces and these claims. Here are the claims being made. And then human assessment teams like Replicats, if you've heard of that, and the machine teams assessed those 3,900 papers for their quality, for their anticipated replicability. Then behind the scenes, we were not showing them which 600 papers from that 3,900 we selected to conduct repeatability tests. And this was to gather additional evidence about the repeatability of the evidence from those papers that then we would test the ability of those groups to predict the outcomes. This was a very large project. So in total, it involved 865 researchers contributing to different parts of the AI work or the human assessment work or conducting replications or robustness tests or reproducibility efforts. And the outcomes of this were published last week as a collection of 9 papers, and I'll provide some citations at the end if you're interested in looking at this further. So what I want to do next is just summarize the key findings from these 3 types of repeatability: reproducibility, robustness, and replicability. With reproducibility, we asked the very fundamental question: take the original data from the authors, apply the same analysis that they applied in their paper, and see if we observe the same result. This should be occurring 100% of the time, right? The result in the paper is the result from the data when you apply that analysis. There shouldn't be any reason that those are different. But this is a much harder problem than just saying, yeah, just run the same analysis. The first problem is that when we tried to obtain the data for the original papers, we could only get data for 24% of that sample of 600 papers. There were lots of reasons that we couldn't get the data. Sometimes the authors said, we've lost it. Sometimes they said, we don't know, it's too much work to share it. Sometimes they never responded to our requests. Sometimes they said they couldn't share it for different reasons. But most of the time, we were unable to even access the data in order to test reproducibility. That did vary by discipline. So I showed you those 10 or so different disciplines. We aggregated them into just 6 categories, as I'm showing you here. And this plot is showing of the entire sample of papers that were from political science journals, what proportion in blue were we able to access the data. You can see that in political science and economics, we're able to access about almost 50% of the data. In purple are cases where it was officially restricted data. So the data was, from a firm or proprietary, and so they weren't allowed to share it, but they identified what had occurred. In gray are the occasions where they just didn't or couldn't share it at all. So political science and economics have a lot of sharing, and the dark blue means that they shared both the data and the code that they used to analyze the data. So in political science and economics, we have a lot of data and code sharing, at least in comparison to the other disciplines that we examined. You can see sociology, psychology, business. The amount in dark blue of code and data sharing is very small, although many of those fields also shared the data in lighter blue, just didn't have the code to share with it when we asked for that data. In education, very little was shared at all. So that's the first challenge for verifying research claims, is that we can't access the data to verify them. Then, for those that we were able to get the data to try to reproduce the findings, we were able to precisely reproduce, see the same numbers as in the original paper, about 54% of the time. And then we said, well, okay, maybe we can't always get exactly what they showed, but let's at least get close. And so we defined a tolerance range. So for example, if the p-value was within 0.05 of what was reported in the paper. So if it reported p equals 0.05, as long as the p-value, the reproduction was between 0 and 0.1, we considered it at least approximately reproduced on that variable. And in that case, we reproduced 74% of the studies where we were able to get data and try to reproduce those findings. Now, this should be 100%, and it's not. Now, that does not, however, mean that 46% of the findings are wrong in the original reports. Many of them are probably due to us as trying to independently reproduce the findings, not being able to quite understand what it is they did or be able to follow precisely what they did to produce the results in the paper. We see some evidence of that, correlational evidence, by comparing how well were we able to reproduce the findings based on what we had available to us. So what I've done here is split the data from those cases where we had both data and code on the top, just the author prepared data, or we had to reconstruct the data. So in many fields in the social sciences, they use data from public sources. So it might be data from the census or from polling data that's public data. So if they weren't able to provide us with the data that they used for their research, if we could, we would find it in these public sources and then try to reconstruct the data that they had used and then reanalyze it. In dark blue is the proportion of those studies where we were able to precisely reproduce the findings. And you can see a strong relationship based on what information we had available to whether we were able to reproduce those findings. So if we had the data and the code, 75% of the time, we successfully reproduced the findings, and they approximately reproduced almost 90%. If we had to reconstruct the data ourselves and reconstruct the analysis based on just reading the paper, we succeeded very infrequently. And across all of these combined is our overall reproducibility rate. So one potential causal implication, this is now just a speculative hypothesis because we couldn't test this directly, is that if journals require code and data sharing, or researchers just do it themselves, then we're more likely to achieve reproducibility, probably because of a few reasons. If I know I have to share my data and code for my published papers, I'll feel more accountable to making sure that it's all accurate. And so I'll clean up my code, I'll check my analyses maybe that one last time before publication so that it's more likely that the findings are correct. If I have to share my data and code for the journal, then the journal might be more likely to discover whether my findings are reproducible before publication to identify those errors and correct them. And then finally, if the data and code are available, an independent person trying to reproduce my results is more likely to actually understand what I did because they have access to what I did rather than having to just read the paper and try to figure out, well, he didn't say exactly how he decided to exclude observations. So I have to make a judgment based on what I'm reading. So we eliminate ambiguity and potentially improve reproducibility dramatically by promoting sharing. Okay. We also, as you might expect, see higher reproducibility in political science and economics compared with the other disciplines for those cases where we were able to conduct a reproduction test. Now, you might recall that political science and economics were sharing more than the others, so we were able to do more reproduction tests there, and they're more successful. We think because they're more likely to have used, to have shared both data and code and have a stronger ethos doing that. Whereas other fields, much less was shared, but even for those where we were able to try, we did not succeed as often. Okay, so that's reproductions. The second area of evidence that we pursued was robustness. If we take the same data and we give it to an independent researcher and say, we'd like you to test the question from the original paper, but you make the decisions you think are appropriate for how to analyze the data to test that question. Do we see similar results as the original study? So the way that we did this was we took 100 papers from that sample of 600, and we gave each paper to at least 5 independent reanalysts And we gave them the paper and the data and said, you get to decide how you analyze this data. And we defined two ways of assessing whether we get a similar result. The narrow range was to say we will compare the effect size from the original paper to the reanalyzed paper and assess whether the findings are within 0.05 Cohen's d, right, a standardized metric. That's a very narrow tolerance band because different decisions are being made. And so is it within zero point 0.1 of the original finding is a pretty high bar. With that narrow tolerance range, we observe the same result 31% of the time across these more than 500 attempts of assessing robustness. When we widen that to a plus or minus 0.2 Cohen's d, so a range of 0.4, we see that we observe the same result about 56% of the time. So that is suggesting that there is high heterogeneity in the observed results, depending on decisions that are made in that analysis process. And that is a challenge because that variation is not something that we tend to observe in the papers themselves. When we read a paper, we often think, okay, that's the result from the data that the researcher generated. But that's not precisely correct. That's the result from the data contingent on all of those decisions that they made on how to analyze that data. And so the opportunity of robustness is to clarify hidden areas of uncertainty, hidden variability that's not directly observable through a single analysis, but requires multiple perspectives of how to best analyze that data to understand how variable the findings are in relation to that. So that approach emphasizes the same result in the range of the effect size. And so if you interpret that by different fields, you see that a high proportion of the findings are not robust, meaning that different analysts found different results outside of those tolerance regions. I wouldn't make a big deal out of the differences between fields here. I don't think the sample sizes are quite large enough to say, oh, this is better in this field than that field. But you can see that there is some variation. But there is another way to look at this that is not focused on the effect size and how close the other effects are, but rather, do they come to the same conclusion? So if all that you cared about is the direction of the finding, I think that when I do this, this other thing is more likely to occur. Okay, I don't care how much. It could be a very small effect. It could be a massive effect. As long as it's in the same direction, that's what I care about. When you use that standard, we observe a much higher rate of robustness. You can see about over 70% of the findings across different fields in purple come to the same conclusion, meaning that if they observed a positive result in the original, then they observed a positive result in the reanalysis. And only about a quarter of the time in the lighter blue did they observe a null result in that reanalysis when the original result was a positive result. And then in very small amount, 2% of the findings in yellow, did the reanalysis observe the opposite conclusion. So they observed a positive result in the original study and a negative result in the reanalysis. Now, the fact that that happens at all with the same data is interesting. But what this illustrates is that there is substantial variation in the observed effect sizes and not as much variation in whether the findings just completely go away in terms of statistical significance in becoming null effects from within the same data. Now, how much having, one-fourth, a quarter of the findings become null results in the same data, how worrisome is that? We could discuss that for a long time. There's no clear answer to that. But it does show that the idea of robustness is different depending on the perspective that you take of what question you're trying to answer. If you care about the effect size, those earlier findings are more important. If you only care about direction, these are the more important results. The last thing to point out with robustness is that we do see some variation by type of study. So we compared here findings that were observed from an experimental context where there was a random assignment to different conditions versus an observational context where they were just using data and looking for relationships in that data. And what you can see comparing the purple is that when you're comparing effect sizes, they are more likely to be consistent in experimental contexts than in observational ones. And this is a meaningful difference in terms of statistical significance, although it's an exploratory result. Why might this happen? Well, the obvious potential reason is that observational studies have lots and lots of choices, and experimental studies may have fewer choices to make. So when independent analysts are looking at experimental data, they may not have as many decisions to make, and the nature of experimental design introduces more control. You have randomly assigned people to different conditions. So the types of areas of variation are what types of confounding variables do you address? How do you combine the measures? What type of model do you use to make an inference? Whereas in observational studies, there's lots of choices to make, and potentially many more that have consequence and much less control in the data itself. And so that may be why we observe somewhat less robustness in observational studies. That's just a speculation. This data can't answer that definitively, but it shows that there is a relationship to look at further. Okay, so that's robustness. Now the last of the repeatability measures, replicability. So when we ask the same question, but we pursue different data from the original paper, do we see a similar result? And what we did for this was we identified a sample from that sample of papers from SCORE, and we recruited teams that could conduct the study again. And they could conduct the study again either by collecting new data, which is common in many of the social science research contexts, or they could find data that wasn't used in the original study. So, for example, many studies in political science might be done on polling data. You can't just collect polling data yourself necessarily, and so they would find other data, polling data set that could test the same question as the original research. So what we were able to do replications of 164 papers from this sample across the social behavioral sciences. And on the primary metric, which is, do we observe the same direction and is the finding statistically significant, p less than 0.05, as the original result was? In that case, about half, 49% of the findings were replicated successfully. Now, these are not perfectly powered, and so you need to have high-powered tests in order to observe replication evidence. There was high-powered on average, but not every finding was high-powered, so that can account for some of this. We also can anticipate some regression to the mean because we only selected positive results from the papers for replication. And if you only select positive results, then you are necessarily exaggerating some of the evidence because sometimes negative results occur and are reported. And so we would anticipate some decline there. But when we look at the results in other ways, we also observe additional evidence that the replication evidence is not as strong as the original findings reported. So when we compare effect sizes, for example, they're 58% smaller in the replication studies as compared to the original studies. We can look at both of those things at the same time in a graph that's very much like the one that was mentioned during the introduction from the Reproducibility project in psychology. So what I'm showing you here on the x-axis is the effect size of the original finding from the original paper. And on the y-axis is the effect size from the replication study that was conducted in SCORE. If all of the replications showed the same effect size as the original studies, then all of the data points would be on the dotted line, showing equivalence between them. Any of the dots that each of them representing a finding, any of the dots below the line show that the replication study was weaker in terms of effect size than the original study. And any above the line, the replication effect size was stronger than the original study. So you can see that most of the data points are below the dotted line, indicating that reduction in overall effect size. And then you can also compare just visually those that are in blue versus red, which is indicating whether the replication finding was statistically significant with the same pattern as the original study. So those red ones are smaller because you're less likely to get a significant result if your effect size is weaker than the original study. And those that successfully replicated are more likely to cluster around the original effect size line. Okay, one more thing to say about replicability, which is I described two ways of thinking about replicability. Statistical significance in the same pattern as the original, or just comparing the effect sizes. One of the things that has been prominent in the last decade in discussions about replicability is how do you decide whether something replicates successfully or not? And there's been a lot of different proposals for different ways to think about what is a way to decide, did this successfully replicate or fail to replicate? And I'm showing here 13 different ways that have been proposed in the literature for making that judgment. And this is the overall, the line in the middle of the dark bands. The dark bands represent the 95% confidence interval. The line is the point estimate for what proportion of findings replicated successfully based on that criterion. And you can see that there is a wide range depending on which criterion that you select. The average clusters right around the 50%, like the statistical significance. But there are a couple that are quite high. The one that's the highest is meta-analysis. So take the original result and the replication result, combine their evidence together, and you have a significant result. And most of the time you do. Of course, many people reject this as a measure of replication success because it uses the original evidence as part of the decision. And you might say, well, that's not really fair because they always show positive evidence. So you're just giving positive evidence and maybe it gets a little weaker with the replication. Nevertheless, for people that are thinking cumulatively, do we still have evidence for that finding? You would say, yeah, for a fair number of them. And then others at the bottom, for example, like the one at the very bottom, is the original effect size in the confidence interval of the replication effect size. This is the lowest estimate because it assumes that the original effect size was perfectly estimated, no error, and it treats failures to replicate that are smaller than the original result or that are larger than the original result. And so that's not usually a case where you'd say it's a failure to replicate if I find even stronger evidence for this pattern than the original study. But that criterion does judge it that way. So I like sort of in the middle, about half. Okay, so I want to say one sort of general thing about replication and then close with some things that we've been thinking about at the Center for Open Science. I talked at the beginning about how the initial discovery might establish that blue dot of here's where we've observed the evidence, and a wider sense of we think it might generalize to these other contexts. It isn't just about this sample with this treatment, measuring this outcome in this setting. We think it'll occur across many different occasions. We think we found something that is a regularity about nature. And as we pursue research, as time goes by, moving up from that initial discovery, if we continuously are successful in replicating a finding as we test different contexts, test different manipulations, test different outcome measures, the blue dot continues to expand. It fills the space where we think it could generalize because we are showing that it does generalize to those different contexts. Whereas if we fail to replicate that original finding, then our confidence in the original finding might shrink a little bit. That blue dot's getting smaller. And we might say, oh, this might not be as general as we thought it was. And so our confidence in the space that it will generalize to shrinks as well. And if we just continue to fail to replicate it over time, then we may end up concluding, well, that original discovery, it might have just been an accident. Might have been we thought we saw a signal, but it was actually just random noise. Of course, those two extremes are the extremes. Most research is somewhere in the middle. We see it here, we don't see it here, we puzzle about why is it that we're observing this. And that's what's exciting about research, is that we think we've understood something, we think we've discovered something, and then the follow-on research helps us to clarify what we think we observed. Did we actually observe that? What's the actual explanation? And that makes replication an essential part of theory development, of how it is we accumulate understanding, because we are confronting our current understanding with an occasion where we think we'll observe the same evidence again. And when we do, we get more confident in that explanation. And when we don't, we say, huh, wait a second, we need to study this a little bit more. Okay, so that's the evidence from SCORE. I didn't talk about the AI predicting or the human assessments predicting. I'm happy to discuss that or point you to the papers where we unpack that. I want to close with just highlighting sort of the issues that we wrestle with at the Center for Open Science. And the core concern that we have is that the reward system is about producing papers. I am incentivized to get my work published and not rewarded directly for getting it right in the way the system operates routinely. And so we know that not everything gets published. We're more likely to get published by producing certain kinds of results than other kinds of results. I'm more likely to get publishing a positive result than a negative result. I'm more likely to get published if I find something new rather than identifying additional evidence for a prior claim. And I'm more likely to get published if my evidence all fits together neatly and nicely, and I don't have things that are uncertain and unclear. So those are rewards based on the outcomes that we produce. And the challenge that we think that that creates in the research culture is that I have lots of discretion in the choices that I make as I do research. And that discretion means that when there are outcomes that are better for me, then I might select those outcomes as the things to publish because I can advance my career. And I am not just trying to produce papers, I'm trying to discover true things. But we have lots of ordinary thinking that rationalizes our behaviors. And when we have a reward for certain types of behaviors, we may be able to convince ourselves that the right thing to do is the thing that actually advances my career the most. And so as a consequence, if I have choices I do 20 experiments and 3 of them show positive results, I might put those 3 in the paper and ignore the other 17. Now that's going to make my findings less replicable than they would otherwise be because I'm ignoring some evidence. I might have a 4th finding where if I analyze it 4 or 5 different ways, the way that I analyze it this way becomes a significant result, and the other ways I analyze it are not significant. I might rationalize to myself that the right way to analyze it is the way that produces that significant result and lower the robustness and the replicability of the findings as a consequence. So that's where we are interested in trying to tackle through open science how it is we can address some of that reward system. By promoting open data, sharing materials like the surveys, the methods, the protocols, the procedures, and the code that we use to analyze our data, we can make it easier for you to assess the decisions that I make. And I am more accountable to those decisions because I know that you can look at how it is I decided what I was going to do in those research, how I decided to analyze those data, what alternatives to the analysis I might have tried but didn't put into the paper. Also, it's easier for you by me sharing all of this for you to conduct a replication of my work or test its robustness independently of me to assess the reliability of that evidence. We love the concept of pre-registration because it solves two issues. One is that it makes it discoverable that I did those 20 experiments. And if only 3 of them are in the paper, you can ask, Brian, why didn't you report those other 17 studies? And I can give you my explanation, but then you can assess whether the evidence in whole is really as credible for the paper as I think it is. And then the other thing that pre-registration helps with is it makes it very clear which things I planned before I observed the data and which things were unplanned that I discovered or analyzed interactively with the data that might still be very interesting discoveries, might be important insights, but have more uncertainty because they were decisions that were done in context of observing the data rather than decisions that were made independently of the data to confront myself with those decisions. So we think that has lots of opportunity to improve some of the robustness and reliability of evidence. We also like to promote replication as something that should be valued because it is important for advancement of knowledge. And we promote the publishing model of registered reports that removes the results from the review process so that instead of the reward system being about publishing exciting results, the reward system is about asking important questions and designing really effective methods to test those questions. And that's what reviewers in registered reports make their judgment on. And then the journal commits to publishing the research that has not yet been completed, as long as you follow through with what you said you were going to do. And they do not decide based on are the results exciting or novel or positive or tidy. So that's a very exciting approach, we believe. So let me just point out that a lot has changed because of efforts like your network and many other grassroots networks around the world who are promoting different changes in research practice. I mentioned that the SCORE data comes from 2009 to 2018 in gray here. What I'm showing you on the y-axis is the proportion of the 62 journals in the SCORE project that have requirements for data sharing in red, code sharing in blue, and actually the journals themselves conduct reproducibility checks on the data before publication in dark blue. And you can see that since 2003, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of journals that require data sharing, code sharing, and do reproducibility checks. And you can also see that from within the SCORE program, it was maximum of almost 30% of journals requiring data sharing, whereas now more than half of those journals require data and code sharing, and almost 20% of them do reproducibility checks themselves prior to publication. So even though we saw very challenging evidence from SCORE about reproducibility, just half of the findings were precisely reproducible. We can anticipate that today things might be a lot better if data and code sharing in fact causes an increase in reproducibility. So that's a positive development. This trend of increasing adoption of open science practices occurs in everywhere that we look. So here is just an example of papers that are mentioning open science and open scholarship in the title or abstract. I stopped at 2022. It's just like it's going crazy how much engagement there is in these topics across different fields. This is showing adoption of registered reports by different journals. It even stopped at 2020, and it's now well over 300 journals offer registered reports as a publishing model. We operate the Open Science Framework, or OSF, that's a free service for doing open science and achieving life cycle open science, plans, outputs, and outcomes all being reported. You can see that as of late last year, we were just shy of 1 million registered users on OSF. It's now crossed 1 million. And those users are registering research at accelerating rates. Now it's crossed 250,000 registrations on OSF of research all across different fields. These rates of change are very encouraging for highlighting that the open science movement and the efforts to try to increase the transparency and trustworthiness of research are really taking hold because researchers really care about the quality of their research and are doing the practices try to change the way the system operates so that we can reward the best research, really rigorous research, and not get caught in the cycle of irreproducibility. So with that, I will end and thank you very much for your time and attention in inviting me today.